Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to Susty Talk. This is Edie's series of conversations with the inspirational leaders who are keeping up the positive momentum and pioneering efforts to drive a green recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. It's Thursday, the 21st of May. Edie's Net Zero Week is now in full swing. We've already heard this week from Christiana Figueres and Jonathan Porritt. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Paul Polman, who many of you will of course know as the former chief executive of Unilever, and he's now working as the co-founder of the sustainability foundation Imagine. Paul, hello. Thank you for joining us. It's been over a year since we last spoke at the Edie Awards in 2019 when you picked up our Lifetime Achievement Award. Tell us where you're connecting from today and what life in lockdown has been like for you.
Well, thank you, Luke, for the opportunity and having such important speakers. I'm honored to be part of that series, and thank you for what you're doing there. I'm actually calling you from Geneva. I lived there since 2000 already, and we're lucky enough to have a yard, and here was my wife, so we're spending the time together. It turns out to be busier than I thought. More people seem to work, more emails, more meetings to participate in, but we're all getting used to this and count ourselves amongst the more fortunate ones. And again, a reminder how we have to fight for the ones that are in different positions and ensure that whatever we come out with now is out of this COVID crisis, that we come out definitely better than we went into it.
And so just for some context then for this discussion, I spoke earlier in the week with Christiana Figueres and Jonathan Porritt. And I have to say they both gave us some real reasons for optimism when it comes to driving a green recovery out of this pandemic. Christiana said there was an opportunity for the solutions to coronavirus and climate change to converge and for us to rewire our economies in the wake of this pandemic. And Jonathan said he thought there was an opportunity now for businesses to really redefine committed leadership and build a better economy than we had before. So, Paul, where do you stand on that point? Can you see a strong relationship between the coronavirus recovery and climate action?
Well, I could not agree more with the previous speakers, although will be a challenge and we need to be very mindful how we do that. But what they are both saying is that there is really no alternative. I think this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to change the way the world looks like. And we were already on a path that people understood that there is an issue with climate change. In fact, $24 trillion of market cap of companies had already agreed on climate action. It's good to remind ourselves that even in the US, green energy had surpassed coal as a source of energy. So many statistics that would point at us moving in the right direction. But what was very clear was that we were not moving at the speed and scale that is needed. And the current pandemic, sad that this may be, has taught us a few lessons. The first one is that you cannot have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. And the relationships between biodiversity, climate, and health is now better understood. Regretfully, but it's better understood. The second thing is that the climate crisis, or the pandemic, has also pointed out is that it's the poor again that suffer disproportionately, not different from climate change. People that live in higher polluting areas, people that are not having access to the same nutrition as we do, seem to pay a disproportionate price again once more. And the third thing I think that is important is the need for science. In climate change, science was denied by some of them, and they were to some extent successful. The coronavirus has again brought science to the foreground. And last but not least, where the bigger challenges will be in global cooperation. We can only solve these crises, the pandemic being an excellent example of that, if we work together. And that's obviously a very difficult thing. I believe that the sustainable recovery that we need doesn't only lead to a better world that we should live in, but I also believe it's actually the best way to get out of this. Over and over, studies are pointing out that it creates more jobs, that they are better jobs, that they are better paid jobs, and actually more secure jobs, because you don't have to deal with the stranded assets and the job losses if you make the wrong decisions. And now, with more countries worrying about their own shop and going back to protecting their own boundaries, if you want to, or borders, we also find that the green recovery actually is more nationally driven than import dependent. If you build bike paths, if you retrofit buildings, if you accelerate the conversion to green energy, if you do landscape restoration, all things that create enormous amounts of employment that we need desperately and unlock global economies are now within reach. So I'm very happy to see that more and more CEOs are calling for a green recovery. In the US, Ceres brought a group of companies together with over $10 trillion of market cap. I'm the vice chair of the UN Global Compact. We bought $2.3 trillion of companies together, 300 of them, more or less, calling for a green recovery. And you see the same happening in Europe, behind the European Green Deal, but also in the different countries, be it Germany, France, the Netherlands, where the business community is saying, you know, let's be smart. Now, short term, there's obviously a need to save lives and to protect livelihoods. So of the 10 trillion money that is spent right now, that has been spent against social protection, against shovel-ready projects, and not enough yet on green recovery. I understand that because the need was immediate, saving lives and protecting jobs. But now that we think about the recovery states, we have a unique opportunity to design it right. And if you go back to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the countries that did that actually benefited a lot. South Korea spent 70% of its recovery money behind green investments, and they were the first ones to come out. The US had actually projects at that time around coastal protection, created 17 times more jobs than investment in fossil. So we didn't learn fully the lesson in the financial crisis. It led to this. We were too slow to react, not holistic enough in terms of converting the economic systems. Now we have that opportunity to do this, but it requires all of us, Luke. There's no question about it.
It does. I'd like to, I guess, dig deeper into this concept then of a green recovery, because there's sort of two primary ways we can look at this. And the first is the policy angle. So at the moment, as you say, governments are understandably have been very much focused on the here and now and overcoming the crisis at hand. But given that we are likely to be entering into an unprecedented recession as a result of this situation, there's a real obvious risk that investment into things like net zero and energy efficiency and the circular economy gets put onto the back burner. So what for you would strong political leadership look like when it comes to recovering from this pandemic in a sustainable way?
Yeah, well, it is very clear that what we've seen, at least in fighting the crisis, that the government's bandwidth is very narrow and it's focused on the here and now. There's not much long-term thinking. And frankly, there's not much global cooperation. This has shown a lack of leadership at the political level, I believe more so than in the private sector. There are obviously exceptions like there are in the private sector in the other way. But governments need help. And what is very clear is that the decision makers in the governments might not really have access to the right information. And it's easier to go back to where we came from. People are starting to talk about restarting the economy again, or going back to what it was before COVID. That would be a tragedy. And what we need to ensure is that the government leaders don't only have the right information, but also that they hear from us loud and clearly, from civil society, from the private sector, that this is a moment to redesign and take some courage. The knowledge that green growth is better growth, the knowledge that it creates more jobs, the knowledge that it actually saves costs also for governments, that it has a higher return on investment for government spending is not fully yet sunk in at the government level. And then you obviously have the vested order or some governments that outright go against it. Unfortunately, some of the bigger governments like the US, where we might have to wait till after the elections to see some meaningful progress. But it doesn't prevent all of us to step up and to help de-risk that political process. In Europe, you have the famous European Green Deal that now needs to translate from words into actions. And I think that the European Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen, Mr. Timmermans, they are a little bit more courageous in moving forward because they hear us all talk about it. When there are bailout packages, we want to make it conditional. When car manufacturers want to reduce the emission standards, other businesses speak up. So there is a moment, I think, now that we all have a responsibility to play to help move this political process forward. But if we don't get the right frameworks and regulations, it's very difficult to get this transition. Even in Europe, we still have about 300 billion, slightly less, of fossil fuel subsidies. We have a price on carbon that is far from what is needed. So these are simple things where regulations need to be put in place, taxonomy on the financial markets, and other things being put in place to accelerate this. And we need to be part of that. It would be too simplistic, I think, with the challenge that we have to only put that burden on the politicians alone.
And you've mentioned a few times there about sort of redesigning or rewiring the economy as a result of this pandemic. Do you have any specific examples of opportunities to do that?
Well, opportunities are tremendous. In fact, there are 17 countries now in Europe that are calling already on the European Commission to accelerate the green plans. You take Poland, for example, a country that has been historically a little bit reticent to move faster, has now seen their building industry collapse. 10% of their economy is the building industry. Why not help Poland now to redesign and get to a greener industry there? They could leapfrog. The Eastern European countries have had a higher cost of finance. Right now, it's zero or negative in many places in the world with the amounts of money that we're willing to pull in to these economies. We can actually help there now, make the finances available that weren't there. Denmark has come with a very good plan with the government where they're saying we're building now offshore wind islands bigger than we've ever done before. Iceland and the Netherlands are making subsidies only available to companies that create a better future, not that came from the past. So Spain has just passed legislation yesterday as we talk on getting to electric vehicles, I think by, don't want to be quoted, by I think 2040, and they're trying to pull it forward and signing off on the Paris Agreement. So we're seeing the countries moving with specific examples on how to green these economies, and we need to support them. We see the same thing in the private sector, where more and more companies are going together and say, this is our moment to accelerate. We've put 68 companies together in the fashion industry, some of the biggest names across the value chain. And they've used this opportunity not only to produce more masks and to go together and solve the immediate crisis, but to also say, what will it take now to get to regenerative cotton? What will it take for all of us to sign up to net zero by 2050? And interestingly, with Imagine, we're starting now to work with the food. And I just came off the line with Agnes Kalibati in Africa, who runs AGRA. We're starting to look at the Food Alliance with a big enough group of CEOs to see if we can accelerate as well. As you know, the food system is one of the major systems of influencing climate change, about 30% of it in the way we produce food, destroy natural environments, waste food, transport of food and all the other things. And actually that should be a value chain that is carbon positive, in my opinion. And I think we can get there in the next 20, 30 years, economically, right, necessity for a survival point of view, and actually makes the companies much more resilient. So these are some very practical examples that are now being worked at an accelerated pace than before, Luke.
Okay, thank you. So the other angle then, just to look at this green recovery from, is obviously the business angle. During your time at Unilever, it's fair to say that you'd really sort of pioneered what it meant to be a truly sustainable business at such scale. Your business model generated 300% shareholder return over the last 10 years, and your sustainable brands were delivering upwards of 70% of your growth. So what for you will good business look like as the world recovers from this pandemic, both from an environmental and social sustainability perspective?
Yeah, we might have been a little bit early when I started in Unilever in 2000 and 2008, early 2009 with the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. And I got a lot of critique and skepticism and cynics. And it's interesting to go back to some of these articles. But now we're more than 10 years further. And there's a lot of data that we didn't have at that point in time. Now it's clear that the ESG outperforms the non-ESG. If you look in the financial market, 77% of the ESG portfolios outperform. We know now that companies that have internalized carbon, that do disclosure, have a price on carbon, tend to be better performers. They have a higher focus on good governance. They understand what is happening out there, and these companies are more responsibly run, just like companies that are more diverse. So the whole ESG has gone up, and I think because of this crisis, the S element, call it the social from environmental, social, and governance, has increased enormously. And the financial community is increasingly able to assess that risk and assign values to that. So it's not surprising either that you see in this crisis that companies that were run with a longer term multi-stakeholder model, with a strong purpose at its core, tend to be companies that have not only performed better into this crisis, but I think are also better placed coming out of the crisis. As you've referred to before, Luc, the challenges are enormous. We need to change our health system. That's very clear. We need to change our food system, which is one of the coming crises that we need to be very mindful of. We need to attack climate change and move to a greener growth model, and all of that whilst moving the financial market to the longer term and trying to make some sense of global governance. This is not easy. So the companies that are going to survive are not only the ones that run this multi-stakeholder longer term model and resilience in that sense, but also companies that can work in partnership, where the leaders take more responsibilities than what would be defined by their own self-interest. And these partnerships have been formed with COVID, tremendous partnerships around making ventilators or masks or getting sanitation products to the stores. Companies have discovered that working together, 1 + 1 is not 3, but 1 + 1 is 11. And I hope that some of these partnerships we can nurture as we move forward. And that's partnerships, by the way, not only in the sectors or between civil society and businesses, but also partnerships with governments. At the end of the day, once more, if the governments don't accelerate investment in R&D, for example, hydrogen or carbon capture storage, battery capacity, we're very close to making this the most viable energy source, out costing, if you want to, or outperforming all the other ones that we have. But it needs a little bit of concerted push, and this is the moment to do that. So it's these business models that work with these partnerships that put society smack in the middle are the business models. Longer term focused are the ones that tend to do best. And obviously, at the end of the day, it all boils down to leadership. We know what needs to be done. We've never been so forewarned about what is happening out there. I also believe we've never been so forearmed to do something about it. And at the end of the day, it takes the leadership and the willpower. Willpower itself, a renewable resource. So we need to invest in these courageous leaders that are willing to feel a little bit uncomfortable, go the extra mile, form these alliances, which are not always easy to do. And that's really what Imagine is focused on, and is going to be very, very important moving forward.
Yeah, we'll come back to your work on Imagine in a moment, actually. But you mentioned alongside partnerships, it sounds like advocacy is a key word here as well in terms of some of those alliances being formed. You mentioned the CEO-led alliance of 155 companies that was formed with the UN Global Compact earlier this week. Most of those organizations in that mix, though, are extremely large organizations. I think between all of them, there's more than 5 million employees involved. And beneath those big corporations, we obviously have the SME market, which here in the UK represents 99.9% of the business population. Many SMEs will, of course, be impacted very severely by this pandemic, or be struggling to stay afloat even. And that investment into things like clean energy or science-based targets might just not be viable at the moment. So this may be a bit of an impossible question, Paul, but what does sort of good, sustainable business look like at that SME level as those organizations try desperately to recover from this situation?
There's no question, Luke, that SMEs have suffered disproportionately because they're in a much more fragile situation than many of the bigger companies. But don't underestimate the bigger companies either. There's a major transformations going on in the travel and tourist industry and fashion and others, as you have seen, and some big numbers of unemployment that we need to talk about in a minute, which is probably the bigger challenge that we have. But nevertheless, the estimates are that probably 30% of the SMEs could potentially disappear from our economy. And as a chairman of the International Chambers of Commerce, we spent a disproportionate amount of time with the governments, especially the G20 countries, to ensure that in the rescue packages, the SMEs are supported. Nowhere near enough, we recognize that, but your question is absolutely pertinent. In Unilever itself, when we implemented the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, we have about 80 to 100,000 suppliers, 20,000 chains every year. And most of these suppliers are in fact the SMEs. So the SMEs are tied into the bigger companies, and they can benefit from the decisions these bigger companies take. In Unilever, with our responsible sourcing code, we've definitely made these smaller companies or SMEs more resilient to be in our value chain. Often we talk about trade-off, but it's more a matter of if you run your company for the longer term or for the shorter term. If you run it for the longer term, it's better to pay your employees well. If you run it for the short term, you might squeeze them, but you won't get away with that for long. So even SMEs will now find out that in 70% of the world, green energy is cheaper than fossil. Even SMEs will find out that getting to a more circular economy model and recycling makes more sense. You know, often in a restaurant, before the crisis even, the difference between survival in a restaurant, which is a very tough business, and going under was how you manage food waste. I remember with our Unilever Food Solutions businesses, we could show them as, you know, don't put a piece of bread with every plate, but put a little basket in the middle and you'll see people consume less bread. Don't serve everybody dessert. And when only 10% of the world now wants to eat dessert, you know, make small little things and make it presentable and people would be happier. But to work food waste, for example, is a thing that anybody can do. So I wouldn't say that we live in a world where that all these things are trade-offs anymore. There are many things possible within reach for the SMEs as well that they can be actively doing in their industries alone together and actually tie up with some of the bigger companies and get benefits from that. But I recognize that some things are more difficult, but you don't want to boil the ocean at once or eat the elephant in one bite. Start with the things that make sense. But it is very clear that even the SMEs need to be in industries of the future and need to operate in a way that consumers accept. 90% of consumers don't want to go back to where we came from. And increasingly, they want to buy or deal with companies that are responsible, both social and environmental. And that's, as you say, as much true for the SMEs, which are the bulk of the economy, versus none. And the companies that actually do best now are companies that have adapted very quickly, are innovative, are fast, are agile, and they're often the smaller companies, not the bigger ones, that jump on the enormous opportunities that are currently being presented.
Okay. Thank you. I also wanted to look quickly then at this through the lens of the people who will be watching this conversation, the sustainability, CSR, energy directors and managers who are trying to lead those green business efforts within the organizations they work for. We've heard from hundreds of these professionals who are telling us that their biggest challenges at the moment are they're struggling to engage the rest of the business on climate issues and struggling to work out when and how they kind of drive that engagement. And B, their budgets for sustainability or energy activities are simply being cut or postponed or suspended. So what advice would you have for those professionals who are feeling a bit of an uphill struggle at the moment? Is there anything they could do differently or ways they could approach the conversations to get the buy-in that they need?
Yeah, I recognize that, and I obviously have sympathy for that. At the time of Brexit, which is very regrettable in the UK, as we are now discovering, is also the CEOs got sidetracked. And I think with the immediate dealing with the COVID, which had the attention and keeping companies afloat and just having your liquidity work for many of the companies, as you already referred to before, requires some attention here and now. And it's normal that the human being is drawn to the immediate and urgent versus the important and perhaps a little bit longer term. So bear with your management for that and understand also their pressures for the time being. But increasingly, the CEOs I talk to, big and small companies alike, are starting to think of how do we come out of this and how do we come out of this better. After having survived this shock or adjusted to it in many ways, taking care of your people, dealing with the enormous stress, including the mental pressures, etc., more and more people are thinking about, hey, what has happened in society? And there is no doubt that some trends have accelerated, new trends will be coming, but that we're going to live in a different abnormal than what we came from before. And if companies don't adapt and internalize, they're not going to survive. So the first step for sustainability officers is to engage. Engage, first of all, with the HR departments and the management around purpose, around bringing humanity back to business, running your businesses with a higher level of empathy, etc. Then the second thing is bring the data on the conversion, where the greener economy, from whatever study you pick up on food and land use, on resilience, on cities, points to enormous opportunities in both job creation and in terms of economic opportunities for a greener economy. So familiarize yourself with this and see what the opportunities are for your companies. And slowly but surely start having these conversations at a strategic level for management. But don't get energy sapped from the current situation where you might find that the CEO doesn't have time for you. The CEO, he or she, also is at home, has to juggle their time with their children, with all the other things, and with the pressures of a company that they've never had before. This is a bigger recession than mankind has ever faced. So have a little bit of sympathy for that and start preparing that ground for the future is probably an opportunity. Think about the things you can do with technology now that is going to accelerate. Your travel will totally change. Your carbon footprint as a company will totally change. That's the thing. If you don't do it, you'll be uncompetitive. Start thinking about the different role of governments now. After having invested 10, 15 trillion in these economies, governments are going to play a different role. How can you as a company be part of that and influence that in the positive sense, or to be of interest to your CEO as well? And start to look at some of these other trends that we've talked during this talk to internalize those to your advantage. And I think you'll have a very willing ear with the majority of the CEOs, just as we have seen quite a big group of companies managing this crisis responsibly. I'm actually, to a great extent, proud of the business community. Undoubtedly, some of them have made mistakes, but they've been called out fairly quickly, also in the UK. But the ones that understood this and have risen to the challenge have seen their reputations rise, their businesses do better, their value chain, their employees, their communities more engaged. I think if this crisis has shown us anything, is that it is time for ESG, that it is time for more responsible, sustainable, long-term business models. And you would be well served to gather that evidence and inject that into the companies so that that thinking also gets to your board level. If finally it doesn't, which I'm sure that there will be 15, 20 or 25% of the companies where the CEOs don't get it, fine. Then I'd say there are better things in life to do if you want to live a life with purpose. And those companies have had a hard time already before attracting people. And I think it will be even more difficult in the future. So don't work for dinosaurs, bring them to the graveyard, but work for people that get it and want to be well positioned as resilient companies for years to come. And more importantly, want to make a difference to creating a better world for all. That's why we're after all here.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, so I'm conscious of your time, Paul. I know we've probably only got about a few minutes left. So I wanted to ask you just quickly a bit more about you and the work you've been doing. Firstly, with a quick reflection on your time there at Unilever, because I know it was over a year now since you stepped down from the company. You spent 10 years at the helm there, took the company to the top of pretty much every sustainability list and ranking that there is. So what was the biggest or most important thing you learnt about sustainability leadership and corporate social responsibility during that 10 years? Is there a particular secret to success or advice you would give your former self just joining the business when it comes to sustainability?
Well, I don't do that for myself, nor do I believe in a legacy. I'm very proud that Alan Job has really taken over and hit the ground running. And actually in this COVID crisis, he's shown once more what the fabric is that Unilever is made of. 100 million in products donated, if I read it well, 500 million in financing to people in the value chain, more than any bank is volunteering to do. So I'm very proud that I've been able to lead that great institution, but even prouder to see that these values permeate now in this challenging time, because companies are being called out during challenges, not when everything goes well. This is the moment to see if companies are serious about ESG and all that. What I've learned in my 10 years in Unilever is what we were trying to show, that multi-stakeholder longer-term business models are actually ultimately good for the shareholders as well, not as an objective, but as a result. And you've already alluded to the 300% return, the 19% return on invested capital. But I also think that putting the sustainable development goals at the center of it and making it a purpose-driven business model like we've done for all of our brands is actually turning out to be very profitable. And because it's very profitable, it's also so much more difficult to unwind. People said, are you worried when you leave that the company will slip back? No, Alan Job is actually driving it higher and seeing this tremendous potential that is there. So that's a learning for all of us, and it's now backed up with a lot more data that make it easier, I think, to sell. The financial community is getting interested in it. More and more consumers are asking for it. We talked about some responsible governments that are starting to understand it. So now we need to build this momentum at scale and speed. And that's exactly why I left Unilever. I thought 10 years is enough anyway, 10 years on the dot. But I also felt that CEOs alone can only do so much. And even within industries, they can only achieve so much. And the demand on CEOs is getting bigger and bigger. But some of the CEOs, like now we're working with the agriculture CEOs in Africa, wanting to solve the issues of food security, the locals and all that. And they say, I cannot deal with myself as an individual company with all the bureaucracy in Africa, or I don't have all the pieces of the value chain. So we've created Imagine. What Imagine is doing is bringing the CEOs of the bigger companies together at a global level across the value chain by industry sector. And now that we have 25 to 30% of these CEOs together, we can actually get them to be more courageous, feel a little bit more uncomfortable at the group behavior, but also start working on these tipping points with civil society, with governments, to truly make the changes that we need at the scale and speed that we need. So we're very, we think that this is one of the better ways of tackling today's and tomorrow's problems, to ensure that we don't leave anybody behind and create this more sustainable and equitable future that we all aspire to live in.
What's your primary sort of success metric then with Imagine?
Well, we look at two things which are closely related, not surprisingly to you, from the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's climate change and inequality. And that's obviously, as many people have pointed out, and the COVID crisis once more, they're closely related. So any work that we do has to be in line with the achieving the Paris agreements of net zero by 2050, and also has to ensure in a more equity, more dignity and respect, and for the ones that have been left behind, and ultimately more people aspiring or being able to get the lives that we've become accustomed to. The food security alone, with COVID now, the related food security, according to the World Food Programme, is moving the people that are in acute risk of starvation from 100 million to 265 million. We have 826 million people going to bed hungry every day, not even knowing if they wake up the next day. So these are the things that we fight for. And these are the things that we hope to address now with scale and speed, and stop talking about it, but actually move the needle. And that's the ultimate success for all of us.
And that's a good rousing note to end on. Your work there does sound truly fascinating, so I'm really interested to see how things move forward with Imagine. Paul, I realise we've sort of used up even more of your time than we'd initially asked for, so really appreciate the time you've taken.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks to everyone in the ED audience for tuning in. We'll add a link at the end of this article to all of our Susty Talk interviews, and we'll be bringing you another one very soon. But until then, stay safe, stay positive, and keep up that climate action. Thank you and goodbye.